Hey everyone, my name is Wedge, and welcome to this week's Mana Source Tournament Report. We're here with our first standard event of the new year, and also our last before Born of the Gods spoilers start up. It's safe to say that the SCG Open in Indianapolis was representative of the current standard metagame overall. We had a few devotion decks of various stripes as the best represented decks in the event, with a variety of established aggro and control decks, and even an odd mid-range variant filling out the rest of the top 16. Let's dive right in. Owen Turnwald took first place with one of the 3 black devotion decks in the top 16, while the others picked up 7th and 15th. One constant across the decks was the lack of main deck Erebos. This was a trend we saw start to occur last time Black Devotion placed high, and it seems to be continuing. Speaking of trends in Black Devotion decks, we also saw all 3 of these decks running at least one mainboard Farrakhan's Cure, with additional sideboard copies. One deck also made the interesting decision of adding a Ratchet Bomb to the removal suite. It's an unorthodox choice to be sure, but it makes sense with the number of faster aggressive decks and the fact that green-white aggro, while not particularly common, is certainly not a bad idea. Speaking of which, second place went to the only green-white aggro deck in the top 16, run by Andrew Shrout. While we haven't seen the deck in a while, little has changed. The biggest change was the increase in anti-blue hate, with 3 Mistcutter Hydras and 2 Skylashers in the main deck, and enough on board to finish both playsets. Synergies like Experiment 1, Turn 1 into Fleece mainline or Voice of Resurgence Turn 2 make for an alarmingly fast build-up, and with Advent of the Worm and Bestowed Boon Satyr topping the curve, the later game is strong as well. We've been wondering why we haven't seen more of this deck lately, and as this shows, it can still clearly hold its own against the big dogs of Standard. 3rd and 4th were taken by barely different green-red monsters decks. In fact, the only difference between the main decks was the choice of Garruk or Chandra as a one of go along with 4 Domri Raid and 3 Xenagos. The current new thing for this deck is Flesh and Blood, which we've seen a few times before, but here it's featured in both decks. While the Flesh half is rarely relevant, with only 3 potential black sources in the deck and Sylvan Caryatid, Blood is like a fling without the sacrifice. In a deck that ramps into massive scary beasts like this deck does, that's one of the best non-creature spells you could ask for, seeing as how the Planeswalkers have card advantage taken care of. It's that time again, the time when we get to Blue Devotion on the list. Variations of the deck took 5th, 11th, and 14th place, and guess what? Absolutely nothing of significance has changed! We're hoping Born of the Gods either counters the deck hard or at least gives it some new toys to play with. 6th place went to Blue-White Control. While it's easy to think of Blue Devotion as that deck that never changes, to be honest, Blue-White Control is also pretty stable right now. It's still running off the Elspeth Elixir game plan, and truth be told, nothing else has really changed. Though I guess that of all times for a deck to stabilize like this, right before a new set is as good a time as any. Fortunately, the next deck we're looking at is a little more interesting. Red-White Devotion Variations took 8th, 10th, and 12th places. The best of the 3 was a quite different variation with a more mid-range game plan. The creature base is a bit more big red in nature, but with Young Pyromancer added in to get extra value out of the larger spell base and Perforos' trigger. Assemble the Legion and War Leader's Helix also make solid use of the white mana. The other 2 were more like the kind of red-white decks we've seen before, with low drops like Ash Zealot, Burning Tree Emissary, and Frostburn Weird building up a huge Fanatic of Mogus trigger, which, in ideal conditions, could hit for as much as 6 or 7 on turn 4. We saw 2 different takes on Orzhov-colored builds, a white-centric aggro deck and a black-centric control deck. The white-black aggro deck in 9th is a lot like what we saw in Japan a couple weeks ago with Orzhov Charm and Zathrid Necromancer. The black-white control deck that took 13th is also somewhat familiar. We've seen this sort of build before, a deck that looks almost like Black Devotion but without actually using the Devotion angle. Instead, we get the likes of Elspeth and Blood Baron of Escopa, along with some Last Breath for good measure. Rounding out the top 16, in 16th place is something we haven't seen in a long time, Black-White-Red Midrange. To a great extent, this deck looks basically like Black-White-Red good stuff. Blood Baron, Chandra, Elspeth, Thoughtseize, Hero's Downfall, Chained to the Rocks, the list goes on. And with the massive variety of removal that provides, the only non-land playset in the main deck is the aforementioned Thoughtseize. Among the one-ofs is Whip of Erebos, no doubt owing to its fun synergy with Obsidian Ghost Council, which also makes an appearance. Not to mention that whipping back a Sin Collector or a Lifebane zombie presses the hand control angle even further. So yeah, black-white-red midrange, a fun deck if you want to reduce your opponent's maximum hand size to 0. That wraps up the weekend's top 16. As a lot of you probably already know, Born of the Gods spoilers start up next week, and not a moment too soon. Now is a good time for a new set to come along and shake up the standard environment. But that does mean we'll be departing from our usual schedule to bring you daily coverage of what's new and exciting in the new set. Tournament reviews will come back on the other side of Born of the Gods. In the meantime, take in the spoilers. As always, subscribe below for the latest and most reliable Magic the Gathering information you could ever need. This is the Mana Source, I'm Wedge, thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.